Chapter 5, The German Occupiers in Wierzbnik, Staroschwitze. The life of Jewish community in Wierzbnik was deeply affected not only by the policies of the German occupation, common throughout Poland, but also by the individual personalities of the local Germans. In particular, a number of horrific local German policemen were vividly imprinting in survivor memories. The civil administration, Wehrmacht soldiers, and trustees of Aryanized Jewish businesses were mentioned less often and portrayed less negatively than the most notorious policemen. Thus, unlike much recent scholarship, which has focused on the less conspicuous complicity of the civil administration, military and economic managers in imposing Nazi policies in the occupied territories, not surprisingly Jewish survivors, remembered best those who were their most visible and prominent tormentors, particularly among the police. Because German judicial investigators in the 1960s sought information about specific crimes that the Wierzbnik survivors had witnessed, these judicial interviews have a structure and focus determined by the needs of German law, not spontaneous survivor memory and narrative. Under German law in the 1960s, manslaughter committed during the Nazi era had already passed the statute of limitations and could not be charged. Murder and accessory to murder were still within the statute of limitations, but by German penal code, murder was defined as homicide committed under a number of specific conditions, including out of base motive, such as race hatred, or with cruelty, maliciousness, or deceit. When left to narrate their own stories without the structure imposed by the targeted judicial questioning, survivors generally focused on their own families and experiences, not on individual Germans. But the German investigators needed eyewitness evidence, not only about those who had killed, but also about their mindset, motives, and mode of operation that were necessary grounds for a murder indictment. Thus, the judicial testimonies of the 1960s provide an unusual focus on the German perpetrators and are the primary, though not exclusive, source for this chapter. Concerning the Wehrmacht, one survivor opined that German soldiers she initially encountered upon returning to Wierzbnik in the fall of 1939 were not bad people. It was her conclusion that even when they were Germans, soldiers are soldiers. The wife of the Jewish dentist recalled that, despite her husband's providing treatment for many of the German occupiers, the Germans nevertheless treated us very badly, with the exception of members of the Wehrmacht. Another Wierzbnik survivor, Roshmiel Najman, related the remarkable story of the soldier named Hochheim from Austria, a fine human being who would take Roshmiel home from work in his Jeep after curfew on Friday nights. Then he would put away his weapon and stay while Roshmiel's mother lit the Sabbath candles. He was in the army only because he was drafted, and he was opposed to Hitler, he confessed. Not every encounter with the Wehrmacht was benign, however. In the Byzantine, Goldie Sacher recalled witnessing two frightening scenes involving German soldiers. Shortly after the 7 p.m. curfew was imposed in the fall of 1939, when it was still, in fact, broad daylight, though past curfew, she saw from her balcony a young girl walking to the well where German soldiers were washing themselves. One soldier took a gun from his holster, aimed carefully and deliberately, and shot her dead. It was the first killing she had seen. On another occasion, she could see into the backyard of a neighboring house where a cousin was working, when two German soldiers entered and began amusing themselves as they teasingly pulled hairs out of his beard. They continued to beat and torture him until their sadistic urge had been sufficiently satiated. The behavior of the beneficiaries of Aryanization, that is, the placing of Jewish property under the control of non-Jewish commissars, or trustees, covered the spectrum. The family of Ikek Gutermann had scarcely reopened their store in September of 1939 when a Volksdeutscher, ethnic German, who wanted their store and house arrived, accompanied by 5 policemen. They grabbed Ikek's father and beat him until he managed to run out. The family was then given 5 minutes to leave both the house and the store, and the father was fined 20,000 zloty for fleeing. A Volksdeutscher was also placed in charge of the leather goods store of Moshe Neimann's parents. He allowed them to work on the premises, but paid them virtually nothing, as he was singularly focused on how much he could extract from the business to send home. In Boldentine, the Sachers, the wealthiest family in town, experienced a more gradual economic strangulation. A Volksdeutscher moved into town and was appointed commissar in charge of overseeing and administering Jewish property. Initially, he was courteous and friendly, and he and his wife even invited the Sachers for a social visit to see their Christmas decorations. Subsequently, when the Sacher family mill was sealed and the Yashil Sacher was barred from the premises, the commissar apologetically explained that this had occurred on his superior's orders. Eventually, the commissar was replaced, and his successor was anything but friendly. He seized the grandfather's estate for his own residence, and took over another remaining Sacher business as well. In Wiersbennick, the Issers owned a large mechanized bakery that, after the occupation, had to supply the Staroschwitz factories that had been seized by the German state holding company, an industrial conglomerate known as the Reichswerk, Hermann Göring, and run by its subsidiaries, the Braunschweig Steelworks Corporation. The bakery was confiscated by the military administration before the civil administration had taken over, and it installed Otto Bastian from Saarbrücken as its director. Nonetheless, we got along well with Bastian, Shmuel Isser's daughter testified, and I sought Bastian out in Saarbrücken after the war. Apparently, Bastian managed all the confiscated bakeries in town, for another bakery owner's family also felt that they had been well treated by him. In 2 cases, men who would later play a significant role in saving Jewish lives already distinguished themselves as sympathetic to the Jewish plight in the manner in which they managed Jewish-owned businesses. The German who took over the Tenzer's lumber mill took no money out of the business and allowed Jewish workers to stay there. He permitted the Tenzers to build a secret hiding place on the premises in anticipation of the worst. Similarly, Mordecai Maslowitz owned a building materials and fuel business that was quickly Aryanized. However, the business was placed under the direction of a Polish engineer named Jacob, who was also head of the Evangelical Orphanage and the Red Cross in Starachwitz. He retained Mordecai as an employee. Jews seldom came into contact with German civil administration, so only a few individual survivors remembered those for whom they had performed some kind of service and from whom they had received advice or warning. Herschel Rubinstein's father owned a major butcher shop, which initially provided German officials, including the Kreishauptmann, or county chief, Hans Zettelmeyer, with meat. Eventually, Rubinstein worked in the Zettelmeyers' house, shopping and doing errands for them, as well as playing with their children. In 1941, Zettelmeyer advised Herschel to get a factory job. Rachmiel Zinger noted that Zettelmeyer was Catholic, and the Jews of Wiersbenich in general considered German Catholics to be somewhat less dangerous. Within the city administration, Zinger also remembered a man named Hupert, a decent man who warned the Jews to flee to Russian side since half of you are going to heaven. Far more prominent in survivor memories are members of the German police. Before delving into individual cases, therefore, some explanation of the organization of the German police forces in Poland is in order. The German police were divided into two main branches, the order police and the security police. In Germany, the former was charged primarily with everyday law enforcement, though its role was vastly expanded in occupied territories. It was divided into two sections, the rural police, or gendarmerie, and the urban police, Schutzpolizei, Schupo. The security police was a more elite organization composed of the Gestapo, with jurisdiction over political crimes, and the criminal police, Kriminalpolizei, or Kripo, somewhat akin to the FBI in the United States, involved in special criminal investigations. All of these branches of the German police were present in Stadterkreuz. As Jewish survivors remembered, the order police were represented by some 15 men of the gendarmerie, as well as several members of the Schutzpolizei, who supervised the blue uniformed Polish municipal police. Of the 15 gendarmes, all were known by sight, but two were especially notorious: Ertel, or Ertl, and Schmidt. Because of his comical, small, crooked, upturned nose, Ertl was almost invariably referred to by his nickname, Nasal, Nasel, or in Polish, Nosek, or in Yiddish, Niesel. Survivors uniformly characterized him as very feared. He patrolled the streets with a large dog that he incited to attack Jews. Only one survivor claimed that Ertl set his dog on people by crying, "Bite the man," possibly conflating visual memories of Ertl and his dog with the notorious story of Kurt Franz, the Treblinka, and his dog Barry. Ertl searched for illegal black market goods and patrolled for those who had left the ghetto without permission, freely beating or shooting those he suspected of transgression. Ertl was termed a sadist, a terror of the Jews and also the non-Jews. And, the worst of all, no Jew in Wiersbenich was sorry to learn that Ertl had been killed in a shootout with Poles in the nearby village of Michelau. Ertl's companion Schmidt was mentioned less often, though when either was on the streets, Jews disappeared into their houses. Most vividly, several survivors remember when Schmidt caught a 17-year-old boy of the Erblum family on a street outside the ghetto. He paraded the unfortunate Jew through the ghetto and into the forest beyond the town. He then returned to the Judenrat and told them where they would find the body that had to be removed and buried. Bodzentine fell within the jurisdiction of a different gendarmerie post under the command of a man named Doomker. In his periodic visits to Bodzentine, Doomker arrested various members of the intelligentsia, both Jews and non-Jews, who were never seen again. Sporadically, he also shot Jews wherever and whenever the spirit moved him. The post-war German judicial investigation by the state prosecutor's office in Hamburg identified a number of gendarmerie members who rotated through Staraschwitze at one time or another. But the three most notorious tormentors of the Jews, Ertel, Schmidt, and Doomker, were never listed as being among the commanding officers or even identified by name by anyone who was interrogated. The head of the Schutzpolizei that supervised the Polish Blue Police in Staraschwitze was Rudolf Unger, a large, well-muscled man of dark complexion who was referred to as Tarzan by the young people who had seen the movie, and Negro, Schwarzer, by the older people who had not. Tarzan was notorious for his beatings. His propensity for inflicting physical abuse was finally his undoing. Under investigation for having beaten to death an ethnic German during interrogation and allegedly facing the prospect of being sent to Dachau, Unger committed suicide in 1944. Within the other major branch of the German police, the security police, or Sicherheitspolizei in Staraschwitze, one name dominated both Jewish memory and post-war German judicial investigation: Walter Becker. The branch office of the security police in Staraschwitze initially was under the Gestapo chief Hans Soltau. However, Soltau and the Gestapo personnel were withdrawn in October 1941 as a manpower economy measure. Thereafter, all local security police matters were handled by Becker, who had been the head of the criminal police desk within Soltau's branch office since the summer of 1940. Born the son of a master cabinet maker in Hamburg in 1897, Walter Becker had joined the German army and fought on the Eastern Front in 1916 and 1917. Then he participated in major battles on the Western Front in 1918. He joined Hamburg's police in 1920 and gained civil service status as a criminal investigator in 1924. Having joined the German Socialist Party, SPD, in 1930, he was temporarily suspended from duty when the Nazis came to power in 1933, but soon was restored to his position. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and attempted to join the SS at the same time, but his SS application was never approved. In the summer of 1940, he was transferred to Hamburg to Staraschwitz, given the rank equivalence of the SS Untersturmführer, second lieutenant, but not actual SS membership, and charged with setting up a criminal police desk within the security police branch office. Just a quick interjection here. That's pretty pathetic if you can't even become an SS member of Hitler's Nazi regime. Like, what kind of person, this is, hold on, I think Instagram has kicked me off. You gotta be a pretty big loser to, if you can't even make Hitler's brown shirts. Delete video. Going live again. This is why I say Periscope, everyone. Periscope. Okay, this is seeming to be a pretty long chapter. Harita, are you the only one watching me? Can you comment? Scroll for old comments. Hey everyone, sorry about that. I keep forgetting to tell you that Instagram TV for some reason only goes for an hour. So I keep saying like, go to Periscope. The link to the Periscope is in my bio. I don't know if you can follow me or not, but if you go to my Instagram biography detail thing, that the link will take you to Periscope. This is also streaming on Periscope. Never used Periscope before, but Jump with the Cat, how are you doing? Yeah, it's weird because it only shows like one user person there, but I never know who's watching or who's not. Okay, so yeah, we'll keep the Instagram going for now, but yeah, if I forget to put it back on, that's because I'm reading a book. And just for safety precautions, always try Periscope as well. Anyway, we are still on Chapter 5, and going to start that at this next paragraph. Basically, I noticed because I was interjecting briefly about how much of a piece of shit this guy is. He wasn't even able and competent enough to become a member of SS, so he was kind of like the poor man's SS person, which is just the lowest of the low in my opinion. Kind of funny. Not that any of this is funny, but alright, back to the book. Born the son of a master cabinet maker in Hamburg. I already read that part. Before the department of the Gestapo, two of its members were known to the Wiersbennik Jews for quite different reasons. On the one hand, there was Alphonse Hayduk, who was on a first-name basis with Becker and frequently joined him in descending upon the Jewish community. He was a brutal puncher, and the screams of his victims could be heard throughout the Gestapo building. To the Jewish tailor, who had to go there to make clothes for the Germans, he boasted of the men he had killed. On the other hand, there was a young man named Dibber, who had lived in Tel Aviv and enjoyed the chance to speak Hebrew until Becker caught him fraternizing with a young Jewish woman one day. With the departure of Saltau and the Gestapo, Becker presided over a very small office. He had a deputy, Friedrich Labon, known to the Jews as the man with the pipe, a chauffeur and adjutant named Franz Braun, and two ethnic German translators, Kanolskik and Schutz. By his own name, Becker supervised the work of some 10 to 15 Polish plainclothes policemen. Labon, like Ertel and Unger, met a violent end. In 1944, he was shot by a fellow German in Staroschwitz during an argument. A frequent visitor to the Jewish quarter, Becker was particularly conspicuous and memorable on two accounts. First, he rode around in a motorcycle with a sidecar. Second, he was insatiable in his relentless search for goods to confiscate. Becker's obvious greed led the Judenrat to follow a conscious policy of bribery, procuring an endless list of items he had only to hint at in the hope that he would not want to destroy the source of his enrichment and thus spare the Jews from deportation. This ultimately mistaken calculation was based in part on overestimating Becker's importance. Over individual Jews in Wiersbennik, he had the power of life and death, but in the large scheme of the German occupation, he was a low-ranking non-entity who would not decide the fate of the community. It was also based in part on a misreading of Becker's character. In comparison with most openly and consistently brutal Germans, Becker often seemed relatively restrained and not ostentatiously cruel, more greedy than bloodthirsty. Three Jewish girls who did cleaning for him had no complaint about any personal abuse. In several other cases, he treated Jews decently or even intervened on their behalf. For instance, when one family was threatened by Becker's driver, Braun, they successfully sought the help of the Polish police chief, and as intermediary to Becker, and Braun did not bother them again. There were accounts of Becker both beating and shooting on the open street, but Becker's worst outrages of torture and execution were committed less visibly and far more against Poles than Jews. Two Jews who worked inside Becker's police station, the tailor Roshmiel Shaitan, and a young boy sent to do menial chores, Jolek Arbeiter, have given harrowing accounts. 15-year-old Jolek began working at the Gestapo in the spring of 1941 and continued working for Becker into the spring of 1942. Those brought in for questioning were kept in two cells under a stairwell that were too low to stand up in and that had barbed wire nailed to the floor to prevent prisoners from lying down. For interrogation, prisoners were taken to the Labun's office, where they were tied into his special torture chair. If they did not confess immediately, Labun began beating them with a horsewhip. Becker was present only for the tough customers. If beating was insufficient, the prisoners were served a hot meal. That is, they were tortured with glowing iron rods taken directly from a fire that Arbeiter had to keep burning. After the interrogation had produced the desired confession, Becker made the decision either wegschicken, sent away, or umlegen, put in Braun's car, driven away and shot. Arbeiter then cleaned up the blood. Becker whipped Arbeiter frequently, derided him as a ganef, Yiddish for thief, and repeatedly threatened to kill him. One time, when Becker discovered some dust in the car Arbeiter had just cleaned, he beat him unconscious. Only then did the Judenrat arrange to have another worker sent in his place. In Arbeiter's judgment, unlike so many Germans he saw kill others out of routine obedience and indifference, Becker was a true sadist for whom killing provided pleasure. The tailor who occasionally had to visit Becker's office to make clothing for the Germans said that Becker generally did the office work and gave orders but left the actual infliction of torture to others. According to Nathan Galbard, however, his brother was taken to Becker in late 1941 or early 1942. He had to undress and was beaten by Becker and one other man in a futile attempt to extract information that he did not have. When they finally released him, he was totally battered, bedridden, and spitting blood. He never recovered. If most of Becker's worst cruelties were perpetrated out of sight, he did preside over one spectacular and memorable event that is mentioned by more Wiersbenck survivors than any other episode prior to the deportation: the public hanging of some 16 or 17 Poles in the marketplace of Rheineck, sometime in 1941. Is in any case in which there are 33 different witnesses offering testimony of the same incident, accounts inevitably vary according to date, cause, number of victims, and other details, but the vast majority of witnesses concur on the basics. Following an attack on German personnel in which the Polish attackers were not apprehended, Becker presided over retaliatory collective punishment in the form of a mass hanging of Poles. Crude gallows in the form of soccer goals were constructed in the marketplace square. On a Sunday morning after Mass, the Germans surrounded the square and prevented the Poles exiting the church from leaving. The victims, including some women and at least one young girl, were then brought forth. They stood on stools and had ropes placed around their necks. Becker, who was clearly presiding, gave the orders. The stools were then kicked away, and the bodies were left hanging, at least until the next day, if not longer. The Germans forced young Jews wearing masks to carry out this public hanging of Poles. From those testimonies that give the most specific and detailed accounts, the following additions to the core memory of this public mass hanging seem very credible. According to Peretz Zimmerman, whose father ran a butcher shop, this was not the first time Jews had been forced into the role of hangman on behalf of the Germans. Sometime earlier, Jewish police had come and fetched him, 2 brothers, and his brother-in-law. They were put in a horse-drawn wagon along with a bag of ropes and taken to Becker's office. The man with the pipe, Labon, told them that, as they were butchers by profession, they knew how to strangle cows with rope. They were to return at 5 a.m. the next day. Jewish police were stationed outside their house to make sure they did not flee. The next morning, the young Jewish butchers were taken by truck, along with 8 prisoners, 5 men and 3 women, to a small town a 2-hour drive from Wiersbenich, where they saw many German troops positioned on the rooftops. Becker went up to them and told them to do a good job or they would be next. The victims were placed on chairs. Ropes were put around their necks by Zimmerman's brother standing on a stepladder. The chairs were then kicked away. It was all over in about 4 minutes. Everybody in the town, looking out their windows, knew who the young Jews were. Word got back to Wiersbenich about what they had been forced to do, even before they returned. And relatives were afraid to be seen with them for the fear of Polish retaliation. Some months later, several Germans were fired on, raising an imminent fear of similar German collective reprisals in Wiersbenich. Chana Glatt's brother-in-law was in prison at the time for alleged sabotage while working at the factory. Desperately fearful that he would be included in the anticipated reprisal, her mother approached Shlomo Einsmann of the Judenrat about the possibility of offering their remaining valuables as a bribe for his freedom. Einsmann contacted Becker, and the young man was in fact released. The fear of collective reprisal was fully justified. The Germans demanded that the Judenrat provide 10 executioners. Young Jewish butchers were once again escorted by the Jewish police to Becker. They asked to be disguised and were allowed to wear gypsy clothing and to paint their faces. After the hanging, they were taken into a building where shots were fired to give the impression that they had been executed too. Becker wanted them alive because he thought he would need them again. For the date of the Sunday hanging may as well have been August 31st or September 7th, 1941. A woman who gave birth to her first child on September 5th remembers that her husband took a great risk to fetch a Polish doctor, despite the curfew in effect due to the hangings. The Wiersbennick survivors framed their memories of Becker's spectacular public hanging of Poles in different ways. For many, in response to the German judicial investigators' request for eyewitness evidence pertaining to Becker, it was their most graphic memory of his criminality prior to the Great Deportation Act that destroyed the Jewish community of Wiersbennick. What he did to the Poles then foreshadowed what he would be capable of doing to Jews on a much larger scale later, and their testimony in this first regard gave credibility to their accusations in the second. For some, his scheme of forcing Jews to play the role of executioners added yet another insight into Becker's insidious and malignant character. For his behavior constituted the deliberate and transparent attempt to poison Polish attitudes towards Jews. Most unusual was the position taken by Peretz Cyberman, the only survivor who admitted to having been one of Becker's coerced hangmen. In his account, Cyberman declared that those who were hanged were AK, i.e., members of the Armia Krajowa, or Home Army, a conservative nationalist underground movement that Cyberman viewed as a very anti-Semitic organization responsible for killing many Jews in hiding. Cyberman claimed that they were even more anti-Jewish than anti-German. Though acknowledging that he was uncomfortable about his role in the hangings, he nonetheless asserted, "I knew I hanged the right people." This justification chronologically reversed and telescoped his actions in 1941 with crimes that some AK members committed later, after Jews fled into hiding to evade deportation. Moreover, it was a rationalization that emphasized Polish guilt for anti-Semitism over German guilt for a horrific act of coercion against Jews on the one hand, and murderous collective punishment against Poles on the other. Certainly, Cyberman's perspective was not representative or typical. However, given in 1995 as part of the Shoah Foundation filming project, rather than in 1960s as part of German judicial investigation, it reflects in extreme form a wider trend of the later testimonies in which the portrayal of Poles increasingly bordered on that of co-perpetrators and not just unsympathetic or hostile bystanders. That's the end of Chapter 5.